Welcome to another class about medieval Islamic history. Today I want to speak about Hadith party. Not only is this a party where we're going to do Hadith, but more actually the people who developed Hadith and prophetic practice as an alternate form of law, as a way of countering the executive power of the ruler. And we're going to talk about that. But first, before we get into that, we have to figure out what in the world is a Hadith. So a hadith, plural, a hadith, literally means a report. Sometimes it's often called a khabar or akhbar in plural. Also just means report, a piece of information. Specifically, they're about the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. This all comes together to form something called the sunnah, the tradition. Basically, all that is everything that the Prophet Muhammad did or said in his lifetime. Why is that important? Because the Prophet Muhammad, for those who follow the Sunnah, and many Muslims do, symbolizes a almost perfect being, at least the being who received the last message of God, and therefore had the best understanding as to how to behave and know everything. So we should model ourselves on the basis of him and him alone. Let's just look at quick versions of different hadiths. Here we have Abu Hurairah reported, a man said to the Prophet, advise me. The messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, do not become angry. The man repeated his request, and the Prophet said, do not become angry. Okay, simple idea. But here we see, it's important to be patient. It's important to repeat the repetition of not becoming angry. Underlines just how central this is, and the very fact that keeping control of one's emotions and avoiding excesses and temperament is an important aspect of proper behavior. Let's get more specific. This is another classic one, by the way. Omar ibn Khattab reported, the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, said, verily deeds are only with intentions. Verily every person will only have what they intended. So whoever emigrated to God and his messenger, then his immigration, that is the hijrah from Mecca and Medina, is for God and his messenger. Whoever immigrated to get something in this world or to marry a woman, then his immigration is for whatever he immigrated for. Right, so basically your deeds are judged on your intention. Now that also means that, of course, the question of good intentions. So even if you do something bad or you have a bad result, if the intention was good, you should be judged on that. But also ultimately that if you're doing something for approval, you're going to be judged by God for your intentions. If you don't have good intentions behind it, as in this case, the act of immigrating from Mecca to Medina, then you do not have then you will not be rewarded for that by God in the same way. And also, just if we notice here, the word here is hijrah, but we have to go back and also think that perhaps at this time it's a report on the nature of hijrah. Was one of those words that had multiple meanings in the early Islamic period. Hijrah not only meant literal immigration, but also fighting in the way of God. This probably would make more sense than the literal meaning of immigrating or emigrating from Mecca to Medina. Here it's obviously whoever fights for God and his messenger, then that's his intention, then he's going to be rewarded that way rather than fighting for material gain or just to get a woman. Now, here's more hadiths. Uqba, the son of al-Harith, said that he married the daughter of Abu Wahab, son of Aziz. Later on, a woman came to him and said, I have suckled Uqba and the woman he married at my breast. Uqba said to her, "Neither did I know that you had suckled me, nor did you tell me." Then he wrote to see the messenger of God in Medina and asked him about this matter. The messenger said, "How can you keep her as a wife when it has been said she suckled from the same breast?" Then Uqba divorced her and she married another man. What's going on here? Technically, the question is one of incest, right? And how do you define familial relations? In this case, this is a good example of a definition of familiar relations being created if two people suckle from the same breast. Milk brothers or milk sisters or milk siblings, in this case, create a relationship of direct kinship. And that's why ultimately he divorced her and they remarried. Sometimes they're very specific, like this one. We used to be happy on Fridays, for there was an old lady who used to pull out the beetroot and put it in a cooking pot with some barley. When we had finished the prayer, we would visit her and she would present that dish before us. So we used to be happy on Fridays because of that. And we never used to take our meals or have our midday nap except after the Friday prayer. By God, that meal contained no fat. So in this case, we actually have a vision of what the Prophet liked to eat, or at least the kind of the simplicity of the meal, right? It's just barley and beetroot. Barley is also very poor grain, easily grown in poor soils. So it's a very, there's no meat, there's no fat, there's nothing in it. It's just a simple, basic dish. So you can even model yourself on the Prophet's example in what he ate. And in fact, we'll see a man named Ahmad ibn Hanbal did precisely that, would try to avoid eating anything that did not exist at the Prophet's time, or was not eaten by the Prophet. We can also go further. The Prophet ate of the meat of a shoulder by cutting the meat with his teeth, and then got up and offered the prayer without performing the ablution anew. So here is a question of basically, does meat or let's say the remnants of an animal, of a dead animal, is it polluting, or do you need to do an ablution again afterwards? You need to do ablutions. You need to ritually cleanse yourself to perform the prayer. So here is again just a question of, well, what are the boundaries of cleanliness? Then there's a hadith like this: the messenger of God said, eggplants are a cure for every illness. Now, did the Prophet Muhammad say this? Would eggplants then become the basic vegetable, most central vegetable for Muslim medicinal practice? Do we actually know if this is a reliable hadith or not? And it turns out it's not. How did people back then know that hadiths were reliable? Well, this started being an issue around the time of Abdul Malik. Let me see if I have another slide. Abdul Malik was the Umayyad caliph. He was the one who kind of, after the Second Civil War, introduced many different aspects of the new kind of Muslim practice, re-emphasizing the central role of the Prophet Muhammad and believing in him as the final seal of the prophets. So from there we get, this is the very first time that we have biographies of the Prophet, and at the same time, at this point, about 150, 200 years afterwards, people start collecting hadiths, that is, reports about what the Prophet Muhammad did. Now, initially, these reports are just kept by the community. I mean, they're just people had been sharing stories about the Prophet Muhammad and what it was like and what he enjoyed, what he said, because they revered the Prophet Muhammad and they wanted to kind of preserve his memory. So it wasn't a purposeful act. They were just telling stories about him. Now, 150, 200 years afterwards, Muslims started traveling around the Middle East looking for descendants of those first generation of Muslims who had seen and talked to the Prophet himself. Now, to do that, they collected both the stories, the khabar, the information, but they also looked at the chain of transmission, right? So hadith should have multiple chains of transmission. Let me see if I have an example here. So here's the hadith itself. Sorry, not this. Here's the hadith itself. Whenever the Prophet was given an option between two things, he used to select the easier of the two, as long as it was not sinful. But if it was sinful, he would remain far from it. So that's the actual story. But how do we know that's reliable? It comes from this part, the chain of transmission called the isnad. This text part is called the matan. So here we have al-Bukhari. Here's the compiler reported that Yahya, the son of Bukair, narrated to us from Al-Layth, from Uqayl, from Ibn Shuhba, from Urwa, from Aisha, who was one of the Prophet Muhammad's wives, who said this. So we have a direct connection between someone who knew the Prophet when he was alive and the compiler. Now, you've tried to find, these hadith collectors would try to find multiple chains of transmission. They wanted the same thing said by multiple people, multiple witnesses, transmitted by multiple chains of transmission. So they're not just looking for the same people again and again saying the same things. They want redundancy in the transmission chain here. And one of the things they're looking for is logical inconsistencies in the text itself, but also in the chain of transmission. Obviously, someone who wasn't born at the time or in that same region could not have witnessed or passed on a hadith. But they're also looking at the moral condition of the transmitter. They want to know what kind of person is he or she. And to figure that out, you have to look. They started collecting stories about the transmitters themselves, biographies of them. And these were compiled in what are called biographical dictionaries, or tabaqat, which just means generations. Here's an example of one, not direct, kind of translated. This is Sheikh Abu Ahmed Abdullah, son of Adi. So Abu Ahmed is one of his names. The father of Ahmed, Abdullah, is his first name, the son of Adi, also known as Ibn Adi. Ibn is son of Adi. Okay, so here it gives the whole name again. Then we get things like Al-Qattan, Al-Jurjani, so places or tribes that he's from. Was better known as Sheikh Ibn Adi. Then you get a little definition. He was an imam, a prayer leader, and a hadith master of his time. Traveled the world to seek knowledge. He was born this year, 227. He took knowledge. He studied hadith with different scholars at the age of 13 and 290, etc. They'll give you the teachers that he was with. The quality of his transmissions, sorry. And ideally, it will also give you, books about him, books by him, interesting biographical details, things like that. Anything to get a sense of what exactly is being passed on and who is the character of that person. And if they find something suspicious, even unrelated to the hadith itself, for example, if they find that someone had cheated someone out of money or was beating his wife or a murderer, etc., etc., maybe not beating his wife, but this would be cause to remove them from the chain, to regard that chain of transmission or that transmitter as unreliable. So we have here, they developed basically a categorization of the quality of hadiths. There's Sahih, trustworthy, authentic, Hasan, which is just good. Sahih is the best one. And then there's different types of weak hadiths. There's fabricated ones that have been denounced as false, ones that are just too shaky. So an example of false hadith is the one I gave you for eggplants are cured for every illness. One thing to think about is, why did Muslims continue to collect supposedly false hadiths? Is there any benefit to them? Often students will point out that you need to collect the false hadiths to know which ones are false, right? And to document that. And that was certainly one of the benefits of collecting them. But people continue to use the idea of false hadiths, and especially if they just encapsulated something, a general smart lesson. For example, this one, seek knowledge, even if you have to go to China. Most hadith collectors clearly say that it's weak, it's fabricated, it's not authentic. It is most definitely fake, and yet it's still commonly used today, partially because it's so widely circulated that at a certain point it just became it was decided that it was still useful and true in that sense. Now, this idea that the morality of the transmitter is itself very important is a bit different to us. I mean, maybe in most recent years, since the last 10 years, we've increasingly looked at the morality of transmitters, or at least the morality of teachers, right? Normally, we wouldn't consider or wouldn't insist that our scholars or scientists be good moral beings. So, for example, we don't expect scientists who behave horribly to have citations removed or not be a source of knowledge, or that their research can't be cited. But today, we have basically a slightly different shift with this. People are increasingly thinking about the moral quality of scientists. And there is on occasion movements to stop citing someone for grave moral violations. So to put this more directly, we can ask even, if a professor sexually harasses his students, do you think it's acceptable to stop citing his work? So this is a poll I did a few years ago, but at least in the previous class, they were asked, most of them said no, that it still depends, even with repugnant moral character, you can still cite his work. Whereas a significant number did say that it was acceptable to stop citing him, that the moral character of the person is a good enough proxy for stopping citation. And in fact, people might argue that in the end, there's always others you can cite to avoid having to cite that one person. Now, the people that collected and memorized hadiths were called the Ahl al-Hadith, the people of tradition, the people of the hadith party. And they came to eventually call themselves the Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of tradition and the majority community. So they started calling themselves the hadith people, the people who were collecting them. And then they transformed over time into something called the Sunnis, right? That the Sunnah was itself the defining characteristic of being Muslim. And this was already part of the increasing emphasis on the Prophet after the Second Civil War among the Muslims. So if you remember, that one of the things that Abdul Malik added is to the different aspects of the Shahada and on coins is that Muhammad is the Prophet of God, right? That he is the messenger of God. Now, he did that in a kind of closing of that ecumenical community that Fred Donner talks about. But what this meant is that there was increased emphasis on Muhammad as the central figure of Islam. And so therefore people needed to know exactly what he was doing and what was he like. And so around 680, 690, now, as you can see, about 60 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, but this continued even more so and became, around 680, 690, people started collecting hadith right around the time of Abdul Malik. And this started initially in Iraq, so Kufa, Basra, these sort of areas. And the movement really took off around 750 to 850, so between 120 to 200 years afterwards, 220 years afterwards, is the high point of the hadith movement. And that coincides perfectly within the first century, the high point of the Abbasid Empire. Now, what did the hadiths have to do with the Abbasids? Well, one of the things that we have to think about is the question of religious authority. Who has the authority to transform the religion? So we've already talked about Abdul Malik shifting the name of rulers to that of caliphs. So they went from being deputies of God. The rulers used to be called Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the believers, to now being called increasingly Khalifat Allah, deputies of God. Now the question is, who had the prerogative to define what the religion was? If you were a deputy of God as a caliph, shouldn't you be able to undertake work to define that very religion, right? What God's will was. So, for example, the caliphs set about compiling and collecting the Quran. They said they were setting precedent, appointing judges, and they were building religious monuments. So is this part of the work of a caliph? So the Hadith party, though, said no, that the work of defining what the religion is, defining what the community believes, is not supposed to be in the hands of the ruler. It's not supposed to be in the hands of the caliph. Religious authority was supposed to be in the hands of the society itself, within the people of tradition, the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So let's go back and see that slide for a second, right? The people of tradition, the majority community. So within the majority of Muslims themselves lay religious authority. And that's the idea of Sunnism, right? It's not a leader, it's not the caliph, it's not a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, but within the Muslim community itself. So we have this kind of fight even emerging within the hadiths themselves. So look at this apocryphal hadith. It said the Islamic State will be ruled by kings after 30 years. So what does that mean? Does that mean a breakdown of religious faith? No, but that rather rulers are not supposed to be caliphs. They're not supposed to change Islam itself. They're just supposed to be secular kings, right? So this is a hadith, even if it's not true, reflects that type of understanding. And in fact, this was already under the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik. There was a strong critique of the hadith people. He's saying, as always, listen to the Quran. You can't listen, don't focus on the hadith. Don't focus on the Prophet Muhammad. Don't listen to these people who are collecting them. Said, Medinans, of all people, you have the greatest claim to practice Islam as it was originally. Many oral reports from the inhabitants of the East have flooded us. So the East being Iraq, but also much further east, Iran. But we do not recognize them. We recognize not a single tradition except the recitation of the Quran. So he's saying just the Quran is important, not these traditions. There's reports about the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. So we hold fast to what is contained in your Quran, the same Quran around which the unjustly slain Imam Uthman united you, etc., etc. So the important part is the Quran is the central part. So it's Abdul Malik trying to stop the Hadith people. Now, question is, no one really disagreed that what Muhammad did was important, or at least that he was a figure that one should look up to. The question is what was really inadmissible, what was central, right? So that was what this previous quote was about, saying the Quran is the central point. The example of the Prophet is not that central. It's inadmissible as the creation of law, as the creation of tradition, right? So there's two levels here. One is just in terms of material. So like what stuff is actually being integrated here. And there's the Quran. Everyone agreed that the Quran was the word of God, and that should be the basis of the tradition, Islamic law. But what didn't agree about was basically reported sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. Many people agreed that this was important, but not everyone, as we saw. And then we have the sayings and deeds of the first generations of Muslims. So the first generation that knew the Prophet and was around him and was probably the most pious and believed in him during the hard times, maybe what they did also should set a precedent. This is less imported, but it continues to be an important space of tradition. And then there's things that now no longer enter, which is the administrative practices and decisions of the caliph. So what the caliph does not create, a precedent. It doesn't matter so much. And then we have kind of accepted opinion by Muslims. The majority opinion of Muslims is also possibly a central point of material for deciding what the religion of Islam is, or Islamic law. The other part is not only the material itself, but its origin. And here we have to figure out a few things. One is reports from the Prophet himself, so directly from the Prophet, reports from the companions of the Prophet and subsequent generations. This is what most hadith are. Historical accounts of the caliphs and prophets, so just general histories. And then just general knowledge of accepted practices. So what everyone knows that so and so happened. For hadith people, the hadith party only properly transmitted reports from the Prophet with clear chains of transmission were possible to be used as tradition and to be used for law. And to do so, they started transforming hadith collection into essentially a science itself. They established this idea of the chain of transmission. They made sure that chains of transmission were attached to hadith. And as we'll see, actually, chains of transmission were used in many other forms. They became a basic idea in medieval Islamic thought. They made, instead of giving, everyone who possibly heard this, they just did one person per generation, right? And they focused on the morality of the transmitter. So if we go back and look at that chain of transmission, it's just one person per generation, even though probably multiple people heard it from that person, right? Now, they collected all those together. They made different groups of collections. Some are called musnads. These are hadith collections organized by the transmitter, and some are called sunan. These are organized by the legal topic. Now, by the time of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the Hadith party was at its height. And in fact, al-Shafi'i, one of the famous progenitors, right, the guy who started the idea of Islamic law itself, he said, he took this line from the Quran: instruct them in the book and wisdom. So he took that word wisdom, the book meant the Quran. And the question is, what did this mean, wisdom? And he understood wisdom to be hadith, right? And he said only these two sources, hadith and Quran, not the way the caliphs did, not what the Jews did, not any external information. Those could not be sources for law. Only the Quran and the hadith were. And as we'll see in the next section, ultimately, the power of the Hadith party was challenged. It was challenged by Al-Ma'mun in his Inquisition, or Mihna. And this was a fight over what was the religion of Islam and who had the power to control it. One last thing is that there's certain ideas that were introduced by the Hadith party, which continue to connect here today. One is that this idea of Jama'at. Remember, the Sunnis call themselves the people of tradition and majority consensus. Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'at. So like Jama'at means like communal unity. And this idea that Muslims need to stick together to preserve the legacy of the Prophet Muhammad, but also that in the Muslims themselves lies the authority to decide what the religion is. The second thing, to kind of put aside earlier fights and decisions over who was the legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad, they put together this idea of the four caliphs. They said that the first four rulers, after Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, they were rightly guided. That means they were agreed upon, and they were kind of faultless in their ways. So this meant that one, that they were called caliphs, even though that wasn't really a term that was very frequently used. In fact, they were called Khalifat Rasulullah, deputies of the Messenger of God, even though their actual title was Commander of the Faithful or Commander of the Believers. And there's an idea that they were all rightly guided, that everything they did was basically agreed upon consensus, so we can trust anything they transmitted and what they were doing, that we shouldn't think of them as individualistic transmitters who may have had other intentions. So we have to take their word. And this also put aside kind of the fights over the First Civil War. In this part of this idea that of putting away trying to bury this First Civil Wars, and the idea that that the power of the religion lay in the hands of the people, they put aside the fights over the political authority. So they said, they took up an idea of political quietism, that we have to accept the ruler and not rebel. What that means is that the ruler could be whoever, even in the face of injustice. It's not a problem to obey an unjust ruler. In rebellions, people should stay neutral instead of constantly fighting with each other over who should lead the community, as in the First, Second, and Third Civil Wars. It's better to just not be involved in fights over royal authority. This is not a question for Muslims. This is a question just for rulers. And instead, Muslims should focus on maintaining solidarity and unity and researching the faith and what happened, what the Prophet Muhammad did. So these three ideas, right? Communal unity for Caleb's theory and political quietism continue to define Islam today. With that, I'm going to end. Thank you.